Dr. Arun Gandhi. I'm now going to introduce our first panel debate. I'm going to call all of my panelists to join me on the stage. We're going to have two sort of short but keynote presentations from two members of the panel, and then all four, well, actually it's a bit complicated, but then the panel is going to discuss with me in a debate format the issues, and then we're going to have roving microphones, and we want you to join in as well. The only reason I hesitate and say it's a bit complicated is that our first keynote speaker has to leave for reasons of a busy schedule, has to leave after his presentation, but there will be three of us to have the panel debate. Now, our first session is entitled Rethinking Global Food Security and Sustainable Agriculture from Europe to the World. So, in essence, it sort of picks up on some of the themes just outlined for us by Arun Gandhi. And I mentioned earlier the Sustainable Development Goals, which is a big sort of context for us today. It's worth just noting that the goal number two of these Sustainable Development Goals is to, quote, end hunger, achieve food security and improve nutrition, and promote sustainable agriculture. So there, in a nutshell, is the challenge. Europe, of course, has a central role to play in that challenge. It's the world's biggest food producer as a bloc, and it's also the world's biggest food importer as a bloc. So, you know, you can't talk about the global food balance without talking about the way Europe plays a central role, and that's what our panel is going to talk about. So, please, I'm going to introduce them all and then give them a very warm hand at the end, otherwise we'll be here for too long applauding everybody. So, let me introduce you to Raed Safadi, who is the Deputy Director of the Trade and Agriculture Directorate of the OECD. Welcome to you. Please also welcome Ricardo Sanchez Lopez, who is the Food Security Director for Latin America for the Nature Conservancy. A warm welcome also to Ren Wang, who is Assistant Director General at the Agriculture and Consumer Protection Department of the Food and Agriculture Organization. Welcome to you. And also another familiar Brussels figure, please give a very warm welcome to Phil Hogan, EU Commissioner for Agriculture and Rural Development. Phil, welcome to you. And give a very warm welcome to everybody. And Commissioner Hogan is very well trained because he's paused at exactly the right spot. He's going to be our first keynote speaker. So, Phil, the floor is yours, and then you, I know, have to run away, unfortunately, because you've got other things on your schedule. But we're going to enjoy your words, and we will then chew them over after you've gone. And who knows how critical we're going to be? You'll never know. But anyway, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Stephen, Yanis, Franz, fellow panelists, ladies and gentlemen. It is indeed a great pleasure to be here today and to join former commissioners and indeed many eminent speakers on this very important subject. And today of all days, it is appropriate to talk about the future of agriculture. It is a significant day in the history of the CAP. It's the last day of EU milk quotas. But I'll say more about that later. Let me start by talking about what I believe global food security and sustainable agriculture means for Europe, what our CAP is doing to achieve this, and then outline what the EU is doing, not only via the CAP, to achieve this throughout the world. So what does food security mean from a European perspective? As I see it, the EU has a responsibility to address food security, given the huge global challenge to end poverty and reduce the estimated 11% of the world population facing chronic food insecurity. Most rely on agriculture, indeed, for their livelihoods. And our goal is to ensure that the EU continues to play a key role in satisfying food demand and ensuring food security by enhancing the overall competitiveness of our agri-food sector through various ways. Firstly, by enabling economic operators to rely on policy consistency so they can confidently undertake long-term investment and take advantage of global demand increases. Secondly, by promoting innovation as a motor for quality and value added. And thirdly, by ensuring policy remains essentially non-trade distorting. In this sense, let me just take a few moments to remind you about how much the CAP has changed through a series of reforms over the last 25 years, launched by my compatriot Ray McSharry back in the early 1990s. And we have moved from a system of price support with a heavily protected market to a market-orientated agricultural sector. We have broken the link between subsidies and production so that farmers and agribusiness look to the market rather than to Brussels when they decide what they will produce. And as a result, we have a more modern, more competitive sector, and we have seen considerable investment in innovation as the sector has moved forward. Nevertheless, we still face the fundamental challenge of how to increase production while respecting our natural resources, how to produce more using less. So what does sustainable agriculture in Europe mean? I have said on several occasions, and I've heard it said today already by Franz Fischler, that EU agribusinesses continue to be economically sustainable if they are not environmentally sustainable. There are two sides of the same coin. Sustainability is a central component of the CAP and is reflected in three long-term CAP objectives: viable food production, sustainable management of natural resources and climate action, and balanced territorial development. And following the 2013 reform, 30% of direct payments to European farmers are linked with using environmentally friendly agronomic methods. These methods, such as crop diversification, ecological focus areas, maintaining permanent pastures, play a very important role for the good management of water, for fighting soil erosion and biodiversity loss, and preserving natural landscapes. Moreover, 30% of the funds for rural development investments are linked to fighting climate change. This includes measures for agri-environment and climatic purposes, organic farming, and payments for areas facing natural constraints. So in financial terms, this means that approximately €100 billion is directly related to the delivery of environmentally public goods. So what is the EU doing to help food security and sustainable agriculture elsewhere in the world? The EU has a commitment in the treaty to policy coherence for development. This means that we make sure that our agricultural and agri-trade policies remain compatible with development priorities and are non-trade, non-market distorting. The EU has moved away from intervening in the normal functioning of our agricultural markets. We have moved from supporting products to supporting producers. Our trade policy is development friendly, open to least developed and many other developing countries and not requiring reciprocity. We have practically put an end to export subsidies. Since the 1st of January 2014, export refunds have ceased to be an option as a means of systematically supporting a sector. Moreover, in the framework of the economic partnership agreements in West, Eastern and Southern Africa, the EU commits itself to stop any export subsidies. So the key point is that the changes in the policy have rendered such a policy tool irrelevant. The EU now has a much more open market than in the past, and it is through trade that the EU is making a major contribution to global food security, with balanced two-way trade as well as openness to imports from developing countries. And thanks to the reform CAP and the massive efforts of our farmers and producers, the EU is now the world's biggest importer and exporter of agri-food. High value-added products, notably drink and spirits, but not only that, contributed to that export performance and the surplus. Our trade openness to developing countries contributes to boosting the agricultural sector and the rural economy in these countries. So in more global terms, how can the European Union work with the United Nations on these issues of food security and sustainable agriculture? The proposed Sustainable Development Goals is an opportunity, and targets are broadly welcomed by the EU as a good basis for developing the post-2015 development agenda. These goals will apply to all. Political commitment is needed. Contributions towards reaching those goals must be fairly shared at all levels of development and by all countries. And this agenda calls for change to end extreme poverty, which is mostly rural, to promote research and innovation for sustainable agriculture, to end hunger, and the list goes on and on. But to be credible, we need to have a clear set of ambitious and realistic goals that are accompanied by achievable and measurable targets. Goal 2, that is to end hunger, achieve food security, and improve nutrition and promote sustainable agriculture, requires a wide range of actions. And countries' domestic policy environments, financial and non-financial instruments are key to success. One of the biggest challenges in the negotiations ahead will be around how the burden of responsibility will be shared. Let me assure you that European agriculture is ready to play its role. As this is the last day for EU milk quotas, let me just provide a few concrete examples of how European policy on agriculture has changed from the day 31 years ago when quotas were first introduced. And can I say that farmers weren't happy then, and they're not too happy now either. I feel it is symbolic of the path that EU agriculture has taken and fits into rethinking global food security and sustainable agriculture from Europe to the world. Quotas were introduced in 1984 in order to halt the steady expansion of European production at a rate much faster than domestic demand. The price support system led to skim milk powder and butter mountains of more than 1 million tonnes. These surpluses were frequently subsidised onto the world market. The CAP reform process of the last 25 years has turned all this around. We have a sector now that is market-oriented. It has looked at the market and seen where the potential for growth is to be found. The volume of European exports has increased by 45% in the last 5 years, but the value of exports has increased by 95% in the same period. And the potential for growth is with value-added products like cheese and yogurts and ingredients for nutritional, sports and dietary products. This provides enormous potential for economic growth and jobs in the European Union. So the EU is well placed to benefit from the projected 2% annual growth in global demand. But the challenge for the sector is to build resilience against volatility. Privately developed risk hedging instruments like future markets, but also solutions proposed in relations between farmers and processors have a role to play. The mastering of production costs will be increasingly important, and research and innovation for sustainable production methods can certainly help. And there are many running projects, notably aiming to develop and share knowledge on how grazing can increase grass production, improve animal welfare and performance, reduce environmental impact and lead to better economic results. We need to share better information and knowledge. Research and innovation must be translated into better agricultural practice available for all through involving the most important link in the chain, the farmers, in the process. Innovation is also the key to sustainable food security. Through innovation, we can improve resource efficiency, adapt to climate change, improve food safety, diversity and quality, while maintaining the competitiveness of the agri-food sector and create more and better jobs in rural areas. Sustainable food security was one of the major cross-cutting focus areas identified in Horizon 2020 work programme, and this will remain the case in 2016 and 2017. Activities will deepen the knowledge in fields such as optimum resource use, climate adaptation and mitigation, ecological approaches, plant and animal health. So we will aim at building a competitive, resilient and sustainable food industry that can thrive in the global economy. Healthier diets will finally be a strong focus under this new call. Mr. Chairman, the new CAP has created a more market-driven, equitable and environmentally friendly agricultural policy framework in Europe. The CAP is more effective in addressing domestic food security concerns in a sustainable way. It is better at producing more using less, but we have a long ways to go still. The CAP is also coherent with the EU's commitment towards the developing world. So yes, the policy is much better placed than it used to be to address the challenge of food security and sustainability, but the process continues. The EU still needs to bridge the gap between sustainably driven science and land-constrained production. Let me conclude by saying that it is not only up to the CAP to meet this challenge. The players in the sector also have their role to play. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much to Commissioner Hogan. I know he's got a very full schedule this morning, and I'm very grateful to him, I'm sure we all are, for taking time out to come to our forum and give us the sort of view from the Commission. And I guess it's no great surprise to anybody that the garden looks pretty rosy from the Commission's point of view. You know, the new CAP is terrific. We've got a competitive, sustainable, environmentally responsible European agriculture now. We're all open to the world. We're contributing to global food security, and it all just looks fine and dandy. Maybe. Well, the Commissioner's not here to discuss, but we'll discuss it anyway. So I'm looking forward to getting into a meaty discussion in which you guys are going to be serious contributors, because in our audience we've got representatives of academic institutions, think tanks. Most particularly, we've got farmers and farmers groups represented. We've got other members of the wider rural and agricultural industries. So you guys here represent a fount of experience and insight which we want to bring up to our panel and to the stage in terms of discussion. So that's all to come. But right now, let me introduce our second sort of keynote speaker before we get to the panel discussion. So please give a very warm welcome to the lectern to Ren Wang, who is Assistant Director General, Agriculture and Consumer Protection at the FAO, the UN's FAO. Welcome to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Saka. Mr. Chair of FFA and distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen. It is really a great pleasure and honor for me to be here. And as we know, the year 2015 is going to be a year of transition, when the Millennium Development Goals, which we have worked so hard towards for the past 15 years, will be succeeded by the Sustainable Development Goals, as we call it, SDGs. 63 developing countries have achieved their MDG goals of halving the percentage of their undernourished populations, and 11 of those countries have pushed that number below 5%. Still, some 805 million people remain undernourished, and there are still 2 billion people who are micronutrient deficient, a shocking number. A third of children in developing countries are stunted due to inadequate nutrients. Obesity is a growing problem in developed countries and even in some developing countries. These are the facts that we are now quite familiar with. FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, strongly advocates that the national governments mainstream not just the food, but also nutrition security into their broader policies. As we look towards 2050, we face additional challenge of feeding a population that is expected to surpass the 9 billion mark. With the changing consumption patterns towards more animal products driven by income growth and urbanization, FAO estimates that the world food demand will grow by 60% towards the year 2050. This will be a major challenge considering that our shared land and water resources are already increasingly stressed and at times degraded with the additional challenge of climate change. The combination of demographic pressure and unsustainable agricultural practices poses the risk of a productive capacity breakdown in a growing number of ecosystems, as well as threatening biodiversity. Land use is subject to a number of conflicting pressures: urbanization, maintenance of forest carbon sinks, protection of biodiversity, bioenergy, particularly the increase in the production of food. Food production increases will have to come mostly from boosting yields, not from expanding cropland. We can't expand agricultural lands anymore unless we want to sacrifice precious forests. issues and trade-offs in terms of land use will be crucial. I would like to emphasize the issue of water use. To both increase and stabilize production, there must be an increase in irrigated areas while using less water. Investing in water management is a priority. This is especially true in Africa, where only 7% of the land is irrigated and 4% in sub-Saharan Africa, compared with 38% in Asia. I also think about the importance of preserving agricultural biodiversity, be it domestic, animal, and plant genetic resources, including wild relatives and more broadly, to everything that contributes to proper functioning of ecosystems, including pollinators that are probably the most iconic of examples. A successful agroecological, well, we call it International Agroecology Symposium, was hosted at FFAO in September 2014. Agroecology has sparked a wide range of views and practices, and FAO has an important role to play in supporting countries as they seek solutions that best respond to their individual needs. Urbanization is one of the key challenges for food and nutrition security. By 2050, the world population is expected to reach 9.6 billion, of which 6.3 billion will be urban. This trend brings about some notable challenges for natural resources, rural and urban development, dietary patterns, and urban poverty, and related food and nutritional insecurity risks. This is why FAO, in collaboration with the International Fund for Agricultural Development, the IFAD, and the World Food Programme, the WFP, has voiced the importance of urban food security and nutrition and critically related issues of rural-urban linkages as an essential component of the new UN urban agenda. In this context, addressing food security and nutrition challenges requires a better understanding of the interaction of urban, peri-urban, and rural food systems. The UN Conference on Urban Settlements, the Habitat 3, which is going to be held in 2016, will be the first global conference after the post-2015 development agenda is set. Food security and nutrition are key elements of sustainable urban development. Ladies and gentlemen, engagement in international trade is an essential component of most countries' agricultural development strategies. Trade can also play an important role in ensuring improved food security. The recent food price crisis has threatened food security in many net food importing countries. Consumers, especially the poorest, for whom food accounts for the bulk of consumption, are under increasing price volatility. Today, even though the world produces enough to feed its people, the increasing and unpredictable price rises brutally force many into food insecurity. Increased trade makes it even more necessary to set up the means to limit price volatility. FAO believes that the international community must begin to look at possible solutions, including the improvement of the functioning and the transparency of the market and an appropriate level of emergency stocks. This is all the more necessary as the price volatility affects farmers, especially the poorest. Unpredictability in prices affects not only their income, but also any long-term forecast, downstream contracting, and especially their investment capacity. Distinguished delegates, the year 2015 is expected to be setting a milestone. Also because with the expected noble treaty on climate change, which we anticipate to be developed or agreed in Paris. Climate change is probably going to be the biggest challenge for food security. Discussion on climate change is no longer associated with vague threats in the distant future, but is instead very much focused on the here and now. Climate change is likely to have a disproportionate impact on vulnerable farming-dependent populations in the developing world that are particularly at risk. The challenges posed by climate change present a compelling need to transform the way food systems use natural resources. The challenge for the agricultural and the food sectors is to adapt and increase their resilience in order to feed a growing population. Finally, there is an increase of crises which requires, or disasters, natural disasters, which requires integrated approaches for monitoring, prevention, and early action. FAO is closely involved in the preparation of the SDGs, as well as in the what we call Zero Hunger Challenge, laid down by the United Nations Secretary General Ban Ki-moon in the Rio+20 conference. It includes making all food systems sustainable, doubling small farmers' productivity and income, and drastically reducing food waste. It is increasingly clear that all of those agendas are highly interconnected, and each of them is likely to be instrumental in achieving the goal of sustainably eliminating food insecurity. It calls to question the relations between food security and nutrition, sustainable management of natural resources, sustainable food systems. The high-level panel of experts on food security and nutrition of the UN Committee on World Food Security, or CFS, has underlined that food security and nutrition is linked to the sustainability of food systems. Ladies and gentlemen, hunger, food insecurity, and malnutrition can all be ended sustainably, as our Director General, Mr. Jose Graziano da Silva, has clearly called for, with the engagement of enabling policies and various approaches, such as agroecology, climate-smart agriculture, and biotechnologies, especially based on science and innovations. And it requires political will as well as collaborative efforts at all levels: governments, civil society, the private sector, and farmers, and many players that are involved in food production and marketing will all need to adopt new approaches if we want to succeed in feeding the world in future. With that, I want to thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much to Ren Wang for giving us the perspective from the key UN agency, the Food and Agriculture Organization. You didn't, Ren, I think you were diplomatic. You didn't really address Europe's particular role in the global food challenge. But what you did very effectively do is lay out the scale of the challenge. And I think, we've well established this morning that with a population heading toward 9.5 billion by the middle of the century, with demand for food likely to rise between 60 and 70%, this is a fundamental challenge for producers across the world, for governments across the world. The context for us right now in the panel is to talk about food security, global food security, whether it needs to be rethought as a concept and as a challenge. So I want to bring our other two speakers in right now. They've got perspectives they bring with them from different parts of the world. Raed Safadi, I guess from the Middle East primarily, although he works for the OECD, and Ricardo Sanchez Lopez from Latin America, working with the Nature Conservancy. And I want both of you to give us opening thoughts on this food security challenge, but particularly do address, I think, the words of the Commissioner at the beginning and his conviction that Europe, is the world's biggest block food producer and net importer of foodstuffs as well, is now playing an extraordinarily positive role in global food security. I'd like you to address that in your opening remarks. So, Ricardo, why don't you go first and then Raed?
All right, thank you, Stephen. Good morning to all of you, and it's an honor to be here today representing not only the Nature Conservancy, but also the Latin American Conservation Council, which is a group of companies, private companies, dealing also with how can Latin America be a breadbasket for the world, and how we can actually deal with all the struggles with climate change, with forest protection. And we're totally convinced, we're having a discussion yesterday with the panelists here, that we can actually establish a virtuous circle and a non-violent circle of increasing productivity, increasing conservativity. I don't know if that's a word in English or in Spanish language, but conservativity is also something very important. But above all, increasing profitability. The profit in the farming world, even if it's in Latin America or in Europe or in Asia and Africa, has to be on top of the agenda. And yesterday during the session, Yanis, well, I always bring a friend of mine, Mauro Lucio, who's a Brazilian livestock grower in the Pará state. He tells me, and he has been telling us for the past years, that before talking green, the accounts they don't have to be in red. And yesterday, Yanis said, while talking green, the accounts also, they cannot be in green. So I do think there's a big space for an NGO like the Nature Conservancy to work together in farming profitability and showing that we can actually close the agricultural frontier. That's what we're doing in Latin America. We have still like 500 million hectares of underperforming or degraded lands in Latin America, ready to be into production, either for local markets or international markets. And I would like here to mention the three major pillars we're working as the Latin American Conservation Council. First, the production side. Obviously, it's very important, and perhaps it's very easy to say we're into the sustainable intensification principles. Yes, I mean, saying it here is very, very easy to say, but taking it down to the ground sometimes is not the case. But I do think they're very important policy issues like the roundtables. We work as a Nature Conservancy in the roundtable for livestock in Brazil, in Colombia, in Mexico, and we are aligned with the global roundtable of sustainable beef. What actually we're doing? For example, in Brazil, nowadays we have 40% of Brazil's herd, 80 million cattle, aligned in the roundtable of livestock, working not only with producers, but with slaughterhouses, with retailers, and with supermarkets. I think the value chain approach is very important actually to make sure all these sustainable intensification techniques on the ground can actually take place in a bigger scale. So the production side is very important, and we're actually reducing deforestation in Brazil thanks to a sustainable intensification, pasture management. We have increased in the past 10 years. We rose from 0.8 head per hectare to 1.3 head per hectare. So I do think we can double or we can increase productivity without touching the natural frontier.
But second, can I stop you for a sec?
Yeah.
Because already you're saying interesting things that are sparking questions in my mind. Number one, you know, we associate Latin America increasingly with vast meat production. And I'm just wondering whether, from your perspective, encouraging ever greater maximization of sort of meat production represents a sensible approach to the global food challenge, given all we know about, you know, the relative huge resourcing that goes into meat production as opposed to, you know, plant production. So that's one thought. Another thought is whether you feel that there needs to be a reassessment, again, in the context of global food security, of the commitment to growing plants for fuel. Because, again, a huge issue in parts of Latin America. I'd like to hear both thoughts on both of those.
So from the sustainable livestock perspective, I do think there's a big space to actually, I always say that it's not the cow's fault. And behind it, there's a lot of research led by New Zealand, for example, in the Global Research Alliance, having a better pasture management, less methane emission from the livestock. And I think the world will be demanding animal protein, and if we do it in a rethinking that, talking about rethinking global food security, I do think we have the solution. In Latin America, for example, talking with silvopastoral system, mixing cows, fodder, and trees, I think is a very good, and we have a lot of models to actually show. So I do think there's a big space to work in degraded lands and in underperforming lands to actually make sure we do have a sustainable livestock principles. And then from the biofuels, not only in Brazil, but in other parts of Latin America, we're actually working with a sugar cane, with palm oil for biodiesel and sugar cane for ethanol. There's no competition, as perhaps in the US we see with some other crops. There has been no competition. There's no food security fight between ethanol and food security. So so far, we do not see in Latin America this
How do you mean there's no issue, there's no fight? I mean, in a global sense, when we know that so many hundreds of millions of people are still going hungry, one could argue that we need to look at this in a fully integrated way, and that if vast tracts of land in any one particular part of the world are being given over to fuel production, that makes no sense when so many people in other parts of the world are going hungry.
But in Brazil, for example, in Colombia, where I'm from, there has been no, I mean, I'm talking from the regional perspective, there has been no competition, there has been no forest loss from these crops, and I am pretty sure that if food security was in danger because of this either ethanol or biodiesel derived from the palm oil, I am sure governments will sort of switch, giving more priority to food security. But in Latin America, the debate is not there.
Well, but is that because you're viewing it from a purely Latin American perspective, yes, rather than a fully integrated global perspective, which is where people like Ren Wang, working in global organizations, maybe need to be having discussions with you, saying, you know, in the 21st century, given all of the challenges that we are discussing as the context today, you can't afford to just look at this in terms of your own regional bloc anymore. You have to look at it in terms of global food security.
Yeah, I'm talking on the perspective of Latin America, but we'll have a talk later with Ren during the break session to see how we can manage this later.
All right, well look, Ricardo, leave that there. We may come back to that thought, and people may in the audience may have a thought about it too. But I do want to hear from Raid now. You've been very patient, Raid, waiting your turn.
Yes.
But give us your opening thoughts on the food security challenge.
Yeah, I mean, let's spare a passing thought to the MDGs. Before we embark on the SDGs, let's talk a little bit about the MDGs, the Millennium Development Goals, that is, and their target of having poverty or hunger, sorry, between 1990 and 2015. That objective will not be met. And the reason behind that is not rising food prices. The slowdown in the rate of having reductions in those numbers started way before 2007, from the beginning of the 2000s. What was happening then? Low prices, and yet we did not see an impact on hunger, or a positive impact on hunger. The main reason behind that is stagnating incomes rather than prices. And that is a critical point to keep in mind. So poverty is really the underlying reason behind not meeting the MDG target of having the number of hungry people. And then, therefore, if you believe that, then you start thinking about what sort of an intervention we need to have. First, you talk about development in here, rather than just, focus attention on rising or stagnating or falling food prices. You need to raise the incomes of the poor, right? So they will have access to food at whatever price. And here, the central focus should be on how policies that will raise agricultural productivity growth in a sustainable manner. And this is critical. Also, investment in that sector, whether public or private investment. Moreover, you need to look at the trading system, the global supply of food, right? So that food deficit countries can import from food surplus countries. And policies that will actually, hinder, or barriers that will hinder those flows will have a direct impact on the poor. So basically, you need to, in order to fight food insecurity, you need to fight poverty, you need to raise incomes for the farmers, you need to raise agricultural productivity growth in a sustainable manner, and you need open markets and markets that are fair and transparent so that, the market is actually global. You do not introduce bottlenecks in that market.
So that's a terrific introduction, but I now want to address, because so many people in this room are connected in one way or another with European agriculture, whether you believe that Europe's approach right now helps or hinders efforts to improve the food security situation in those parts of the world where so many people are still going hungry.
I knew that question was coming. But listen, I mean, reforms have been taking place in the CAP. There's no question about it. The income support of the farmers for the last 20 years within Europe has gone from 48% of total income down to 22% late, as of late, right? So, but that's still, the share of income provided by support in total income of farmers. That is an important, actually, reform, but more, of course, can and should be done. And that has to do with the subsidies and with the openness of the European agricultural market to the world.
Yeah, and right? I, as a journalist, have for years, with a very heavy heart, trooped off to, I guess, Geneva to talk to, as it has been for so many years, not anymore, but as it has been, Pascal Lamy, and say, well, where do world trade talks stand now, and what are the big issues? And always, for so many years, the message was, well, one of the biggest problems is agriculture, and it is so difficult to get the Europeans and the Americans to sign up to concessions and to changes which will really open up agricultural markets and help producers in the poorest parts of the world. Has that changed, or is that still the case?
Well, it hasn't changed that dramatically, but discussions today are ongoing in Geneva to try and actually open a little bit the market, be they in the sense of market access issues, but more importantly in terms of the rules of the game, meaning behind the border barriers. And herein, where the game lies in terms of, the cultural differences, the approaches to, or the contribution of the sector to national incomes, be they within the US and within Europe. But we need to realize the political economy here, issues are tremendous in the sense that agriculture is called upon, as a sector, is called upon to achieve many objectives, right? And this is the issue that negotiators, whether in the context of a multilateral negotiations ongoing in Geneva, or in the context of the Trade and Investment Partnership Agreement between the EU and the US, they are actually governed by this political economy issue. And here, one talks about the role of science in terms of determining the outcomes at the end, or the role of some kind of a carve-outs in terms of certain products and what have you. But most importantly, what we need to actually focus on is the leadership of those two markets, actually, in terms of unlocking the negotiations in Geneva and elsewhere.
Right. Okay. Well, Ricardo, you wanted to say something very quickly, and then I've got another question for all of you.
And related to Pascal Lamy's and Roberto Acevedo's actually big goal to someday liberate the tariffs, I think even we have to think beyond the tariffs. And again, in Latin America, I think we have to be working in three major issues that even with zero tariffs, people, small holders, medium holders, or large holders in Latin America would not be able to enter the markets if three conditions are not met, and perhaps Ren mentioned it. First, the soil policy issue is something very important, and perhaps is not in discussion within the WTO, and the land tenure. We, in Latin America, in Africa, even in Asia, we face the land tenure issues, and somebody has to also address them to see how we can actually make sure these smallholders face these issues. Second one, the risk management. We have been talking about how to create an agriculture more resilient to climate change, and I do think it's time to work together with our reinsurance companies to make sure these smallholders can take some kind of reinsurance. And the third one, I was actually talking to Johan last night, all this, the new education of generational farmers. I do think, again, in Latin America, the aging of farmers is something very important, and we have to think, are we ready to prepare these new farmers for these WTO talks once they conclude someday? So I do think like these three issues, which are not part of the WTO debate, need to be covered, especially in a forum like this one.
A final thought from me, and then we're going to get quickly to some audience questions. But I just want, very practically, to ask you whether you feel in certain key areas, when we're talking about food security, certain key areas like, for example, getting rid of waste in the food production cycle, also in the application of the latest technologies and bioscience, including the vexed issue, I guess, of GMOs, whether you feel, and in the whole question of intense but sustainable production, whether you feel Europe is providing the right sort of lead for the rest of the world. Ren, very quickly.
Okay, well, it is a question that difficult to answer in a quick way, but let me try. Of course, as we heard from Commissioner Hogan, that Europe now is the largest exporter and importer of agricultural produce, and of course it has a big impact on world food security. Perhaps I could quickly mention a few key dimensions in my view. One is, as we heard, that the new reformed CAP really encourages market-oriented agriculture, and we have already seen some positive trends, which in my view actually has several really positive sides in sort of constructively or positively affecting food security and agriculture development in the developing world. In that, first of all, let's say a key is the price, reducing price volatility worldwide. And because of, as I mentioned, the export and the import of agricultural products, and also many, we call it the small, medium-sized enterprises in agriculture in Europe, now have a spillover sort of interest and effects in investment in agriculture in developing world. And that we see the trend of encouraging these agro-business development, also engaging smallholding farmers and small, medium-sized enterprises in developing countries. Okay, so measures in Europe to reduce price volatility would be welcome globally. Can I just mention the other side?
Well, I just want you to address very quickly, just because I then want to turn to the audience, but I'm just interested, because we don't have much time to get through an awful lot of issues. We've talked quite a lot about pricing and trade, but I do want to just have you think whether, when it comes to, you know, key sort of challenges like waste and eradication of waste and the application of bioscience, whether Europe is stepping up and playing a lead role to help, you know, producers around the world.
Well, let me first of all addressing this reducing food loss and waste issue. And we see that the EU has a quite ambitious roadmap, which is very positive. And, but I want to sort of addressing what you mentioned, challenges. One challenge, as I see it, or FAO sees it, is the proliferation of voluntary standards by industries. That is a sort of a double-sided sword. Okay, it is positive in encouraging markets and sort of products, but on the other hand, it could present some barriers for accessing markets by smallholding farmers, and also creating sort of risks of increasing food waste, as we say. If a farmer in Kenya has to produce the same size of carrot to fit the industry standard, and that's going to create a large proportion of waste. So we have to address that. But fortunately, we see also the consciousness and awareness of industries, and even in working with FAO, with the private sector, in addressing that. So that is very positive.
And very briefly, bioscience, you see Europe playing a very positive role or not in that area?
I think in general sense, of course, in biotechnologies, we have to understand that biotechnologies, let's say biosciences, is not a synonym of GMOs. So let me leave that GMO issue alone. But biosciences, and of course in general, creates tremendous opportunities, of course. And Europe is playing a leading role in the discovery, in innovations, and in exploring new opportunities. For instance, the recent development in the microbial side, in microbiology research.
Okay. Well, I do want to, because we've got perhaps 10 minutes before we must break for coffee, because we all know coffee is quite important. I want to get a few hands up and get some questions from any of you who have a question on these challenges, the global food security challenges, to our esteemed panel. So we've got a nice crop of hands. Microphones, can you come toward the front first, and we'll then work our way back. If you come down the middle aisle, and sir, you've got your hand up right at the front, and then the gentleman behind you. Just tell us your name and give us a very brief question, if you would.
Yeah, thank you very much. My name is Max Schulman. I'm a farmer from the north, from Finland. And it has been quite an interesting debate here. You have brought up quite a wide ranges of, how would I say, challenges and all of these. But like Stephen just said, how bring it back into Europe, in the European context? I would like to know how you are looking at technology. What kind of a role does technology in general play in it? Because in Europe, we see already today that we have already very high yields. And to be able to boost them, we need technology, since we cannot grow our farm sizes anymore. But that means that we need, again, profitability to be able to invest. And how do you put these two together? Technology to work for you, to the world poverty, to fight against it, but at the same time keep a profitable farming sector inside Europe and still have affordable goods to be sold into the world market.
Great.
I know we have a good policy in place, but that won't, how would I say, help with everything.
Well, I think that's a great question. Who wants to answer it? Who's got an idea of how... It's a conundrum, isn't it? You need the investment. You need to invest in new technologies. That's expensive. You need, at the same time, to keep food affordable as possible for those living in the poorest parts of the world. So, come on.
Maybe if I could...
Affordability, you know, I mean, the key question here, as I said, is actually raising incomes rather than trying to affect, depress prices of food. There's nothing magical about it. I mean, this is supply demand driven, and we want to actually let the market reflect this. If technology comes in, that will enhance the supply capacity, productivity higher, and then prices will go down. Now, do not focus on the effects on prices on the prices on the poor. They matter, yes, but what matters most are ways to raise the incomes of those poor so that they will be able to afford the higher prices in case there are higher prices.
I understand that, but that that raises all sorts of questions about the future of the global economy, which go way beyond even this discussion. But what farmers in Europe want to know is, can they be confident of investing in expensive technologies to improve their production methods if the bottom line is that, right now, the people who need feeding can't afford to pay market prices? I mean, that's the question. How do you, if we're talking about global food security and an integrated global marketplace, how do you make this work?
Could I just maybe...
Well, let Ricardo have a go, because...
Okay. First of all, I totally agree with what you just said. I do think that technology will deal or will be able to have a better profitability, and that's what in Latin America we also do more than the profitability, also to have market access. In many places like Brazil, the technology used is basically to monitor the farms you have to make sure you're not deforesting, you're doing a good land use change. So I think it's a both mixture of profitability and market access. If they didn't have this technology to be used, they will be phased out of any market access. And for many years in Latin America, all this data, because I do think like the data has to be part of the production side. It was seen as like the big brother. Oh my God, the tax people are going to come here and they're going to be checking out what I have, as it happens in Europe, even in France, or like there's a satellite monitoring how much you're producing. But I think this debate has to go beyond the tax issue, but actually make sure you can sell the consumers your technology, and you can show the technology that the consumers you're having a good, sustainable management on your farm. Perhaps the consumers have not been really involved in all this issue. I do think there's something we're lacking, because sometimes we say, oh, I'm also a producer, by the way. The production side is very on the debate, but the consumer side, sometimes they do not value what the producers do down in the ground.
Fair point. Right, I'm going to take a couple of questions in one go, because we're really short of time. You, sir, first. Keep it short if you can.
I'll try to do that. My name is Guy Peer. I'm a researcher at the Helmholtz Center for Environmental Research in Leipzig, Germany, and chairing the communication committee of the Society for Conservation Biology. And what I'm interested is in evidence and knowledge, and I'm wondering how they are used in this discussion. So I see a broad agreement that we need more production, and there's a need for sustainable intensification. And I'm wondering, why is this broad agreement? Do we really need more production? As of 2014, the fact was that we did have enough food to feed 9 billion people already as of now.
Great. Well, stop right there, because that's a great point, and it's a simple one. So let's chew that over, but we'll take one more question at the same time. You, sir, you've got your hand up. Again, short as possible, please.
Pierre-Olivier Dredd from the grain producers in France. To reach a situation where you feed the world, you need not only the quantity, but steady production. And this is the case in Europe because of the special climate we have. And it's not exactly the case in all exporting and producing countries all over the world. So perhaps there is a special role of Europe because of that, not because there is a huge production, but there is a capacity of having a steady production every year, right, and exporting the same quantity to those countries which need it.
I see your point. Okay, so let's deal with these, and brief answers, panel, please. Do we really need more production and to keep focusing so much on how to increase production, or is that actually a false premise?
Well, you want me maybe to quickly answer that. And as I mentioned, the world population is still growing, and as we say, expecting 9.6 billion by the year 2050. So we do need to produce more to feed the increasing number of mouths. But I think the key here is how do we produce it?
But the gentleman's point was actually...
I know. But see, let me finish by saying that the key is to increase the efficiency of resource use in producing food. As we heard, how much grain you produce per drop of water, and also the fertilizer use efficiencies, especially land and water, and labor use efficiency. That is the key.
But just to be very clear, the claim here was that actually we produce enough food today to theoretically, if distribution were different, if the world system were different, to adequately feed 9 billion people. Yeah. Just yes or no, do you accept that?
No, we do not. I mean, there are two elements into the equation. Productivity growth in agriculture has been stagnant. Population growth is increasing. So the gap actually between output and consumption will increase, right? I mean, you'll have more people. Agricultural productivity growth has been stagnant, right? While population growth is going on. So by definition, just arithmetically, you know that you can no longer feed, whether you talk about, 12 billion or whatever billion in 2020, 2025, you need to enhance agricultural productivity.
All right.
That's arithmetic.
Yep. Thank you for that clear view, right? Thank you. Right, we're going to have to end with this one because unfortunately my time management is rubbish, as people who've been here before may remember from previous. So this is the last thought, just an interesting thought from the grain farmer in France. Europe has a key role to play, not just because it's a big producer of food, but particularly because it's such a reliable, such a steady producer of food into world markets. Is that an important point to make?
It is very important, and I would say Europe or any temperate country has been facing the different climate change for many years, summer, winter, fall. in Latin America or in the tropical countries, we're used to have like, a steady production. But I think for the past 10 years, climate change has finally come to this region, because for many years, we all thought in Latin America that climate change is for the penguins in the Antarctica, whatever. But I do think for the past years, there's a lot of diseases that were never present. The phenomenon of El Niño and Niña, which is a rainy and very dry seasons, have come. And obviously, Latin America is struggling also with this steady production myth that for many years we thought it would never arrive. Two issues that I would like here also to leave. We all think that Latin America perhaps is flat, but we also have a lot of hillsides, a lot of slopes, like here in Europe. And I think we also have to debate if this model of hillside production can be a steady or a long-term debate. I do think we have to think about the hillside effect, the mountain, that is also very important, and there's a lot of effects, even more than the flatlands, of climate change. So I would leave it there for the moment.
Okay, well, it was nice to end on a thought about what Europe, can do for the world in terms of reliability of supply. We have to end there, unfortunately, because coffee is important, and it's time for a coffee break. We've got lots and lots coming up after the coffee break, including, first up, Amina Mohammed, who you are going to want to hear from, because she is, in a sense, key architect of the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. So come back for that. But until 5 to 11, please enjoy a quick coffee. Thank you. And thanks to my panel. Thanks very much indeed.